I would not be forthright if I did not mention that the Senate Democrats, when they controlled the upper chamber in 2009 and 2010, failed in its responsibility for not passing legislation that would have solved this problem. I'm pleased that you are holding this forum today, but it would have been far preferable for you to have passed legislation last year, accomplishing what we are seeking here today. That being said, New York State still must end partisan gerrymandering, for it's long overdue in New York, and we call upon the legislature to pass legislation to create an independent redistricting commission before this session concludes. We're all very familiar with the broad principles of redistricting reform, but I just want to highlight the three major ones. Number one is the creation of a new redistricting commission that is independent, representative, and fairly chosen to draw congressional and legislative district lines that do not favor or oppose any incumbent or political party, and uses even-handed and sensible redistricting guidelines and criteria that provide for fair and effective representation of all New Yorkers, including specifically racial and language minority groups. 2, adequate disclosure and opportunities for public input. And 3, preservation and creation of an effective mechanism for legislative approval. Both Governor Cuomo's bill and Senator Gianaris and Assemblymember Jeffries' bills adhere to these principles and create a truly independent redistricting commission. The commission would assist the legislature based on the ensuing federal census. Regarding the structure of an independent commission, Citizens Union supports the use of a nominating committee to eliminate the ability for legislative leaders to directly appoint redistricting commission members. Both of these pieces of legislation accomplish that. The redistricting commission would then be formed with 8 members chosen by each of the 4 legislative leaders from the pool of candidates created by the nominating committee. Despite claims to the contrary, the commission ultimately drawing the lines is balanced between political parties and ensures racial, ethnic, gender, and regional diversity. In terms of the criteria for drawing these lines, once an independent commission is in place, Citizens Union supports the use of fair and balanced criteria. Crucial to any of these redistricting criteria are the following elements. Districts shall not be established that are intended to result in a denial or abridgment of minority voting rights, including the opportunity of minority voters to participate in the political process and to elect candidates of their choice. A very important number 1 criteria. 2, districts shall not be drawn to favor or oppose any political party, incumbent, or challenger. For state legislative lines, a maximum of 1% deviation shall be allowed from the mean population of all districts. This is essential so that no one region of the state is disadvantaged over another in a particular house. Counties, county subdivisions, and towns shall not be divided. Districts shall be as compact as possible, and districts shall unite communities of shared interest and shall be formed so as to promote the orderly and efficient administration of elections. We believe that it is not necessary, as some have claimed, for competitiveness to be a criterion, but rather this criteria that I've just articulated protects against the practice of drawing lines with an intent to discourage competition. In terms of public input and final legislative approval, increased transparency and the ability for the public to participate in the redistricting process are essential elements. The legislature has the authority under the state constitution to approve legislation creating new district lines, and that is why the legislation that's before us today preserves that role while requiring the legislature to vote up or down on 2 plans submitted by the independent commission. If the legislature fails to adopt a plan, they must present their reasons, and then this process is in place to provide a level of transparency and public pressure should the legislature reject the commission's plans. Only if the legislature rejects the first 2 plans could they then amend the 3rd plan that is provided by the commission. In conclusion, let me urge you to use your voices and your immeasurable political skills to bring about this needed reform, and soon. Many are dismissing that the time for such action has passed, but I argue that it is not. Only days remain in this year's legislative session, but we have some powerful points of leverage to bring about this reform. We have historic and unprecedented support within the legislature, and we have Governor Cuomo pledging to veto lines drawn in a partisan manner. And we have the written pledges, as Senator DeLon mentioned earlier, of 24 senators not to support an override of the governor's veto, should it come to that. Those who oppose this are blocked into a corner. The governor is serious about a veto, and those who have not yet fully embraced the need for this reform are finally accepting this possibility of his exercising such a veto. No one wants to take a roll of the dice and have the vetoed plans end up in court next year, with judges impartially drawing the new districts. The leverage we have for action now is very strong if we are prepared to use it. And I ask you to reach out to the governor and coordinate efforts in the closing weeks of this legislative session to achieve redistricting reform. For if you do, you will receive the thanks of an appreciative citizenry who will be glad that you acted and succeeded in restoring the integrity of democratic practice here in New York State. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you, and I'm ready to take any questions should you have any.
Thank you, sir. Questions? Anyone? Assemblyman
Thank you.
Jeffries.
Thank you for your testimony. One question in following up on the argument that has been made by the current Senate majority that the Independent Redistricting Commission approach would be unconstitutional. And it's interesting because there's been sort of an outbreak of constitutionalism amongst the current majority in this broader area of redistricting, including around inmate-based gerrymandering. But on this particular issue, have there been other challenges to independent redistricting in other states around the principle that the separation of powers doctrine that is presumably embedded in other state constitutions as it is in ours is violated?
No, in fact, as far as I know, I do not think that has happened. Largely, the redistricting reform efforts that have taken place over the last 10 or 20 years, and some only in the last year, have largely resulted in citizen initiatives or referendums that have changed directly the Constitution. Ultimately, we would love to see the state constitution changed to allow no involvement of the state legislature in this process. This is the first time, or this is the first example that I'm aware of in this country that a state legislature is actually considering relying upon the advisory opinion and proposals of a commission. This has not really been an issue in the other states where redistricting reform has taken place because that assignment of responsibility has been achieved through state constitutional means. And I do want to say the fact that the New York State Legislature, led by all of you up here, is actually considering this as seriously as it is, because we know of no other state where the level of such a huge level of support exists within the legislature to give up some of its power and rely upon the advisory role of a commission.
Thank you. I have another question from public, and the question is from Phil. Leaving aside the question of when the bill would go into effect, is it better to include independent redistricting provisions through legislation or constitutional amendment? The answer I would have is that right now I believe that only legislation passed by the legislature can impact redistricting this cycle, and any constitutional amendment would impact redistricting after 2020. I believe that's correct. Do you have any comment on that?
I agree with you, Senator DeLon. I think it's preferable that we do have a constitutional amendment. The constitutional amendment that the Senate debated and passed a few months ago was opposed by Citizens Union and the other good government groups for not really addressing some of the significant issues. But philosophically, we do support this notion that there should be a constitutional amendment to change the whole process. But given the fact that the time has run out, we need to turn to legislation, which is why this legislation is before you today.
Thank you. Senator Liz Cruz.